Let's talk about how to stop worrying what people think. This is a topic, as I mentioned just before, that has plagued me for many, many years in my life, almost my whole life. And if you're watching this, it probably has plagued you in some respect. Maybe it still does to this day, because it is a thing that I think is both good and bad in our lives. And I'm going to explain why I think that is. But taken to too much of an extreme, especially on the bad side, it can really limit not just who you are and how you live, but also your enjoyment of life. So that's what I want to talk about today is how to stop up to a certain degree, how to stop worrying what people think, and then really understanding, what you can do even if you do worry a little bit what people think, because in some respects it's never going to go away. It's always there. But there are a lot of things you can do to greatly limit the amount of worry that you feel about what other people think. Before we get into the specifics of worrying what people think, I want to give a really good definition of worry as well. And I can't remember exactly where I heard this. It may have been from Brian Tracy, or it was a similar idea. But the concept is that worry is simply making mental pictures of what you don't want to happen. And that's kind of as complicated as it needs to be. You're actually visualizing a future that you don't want, and then you're kind of emotionalizing or stepping into it. And you're thinking, no, that's not what I want. And so, whenever we worry about something, it's us using our forecasting or our visualizing ability in a way that actually limits us. And that's what we're doing. It's a human trait that we all have, and it can be used for planning and strategizing and visualizing our future in a positive way. But it can also adversely affect us if we fall into the habit of worrying too much and making mental pictures of what we don't want to happen. I wanted to share that up front because that's an integral part of what happens when we worry about what people think of us. Is we're projecting negatively onto them and about what's going to happen if they think a certain way about us. So that's a really key point, is to remember that worry is just a mental projection of what you don't want. And when you catch yourself in the act, you have to say, hey, I'm doing it again. I'm mentally projecting forward and I'm creating a negative version of my future. And that kind of helps you to take a step back a little bit. So that's the first thing to remember. So when we look at worrying what people think, what is it that actually causes us to get into this habit? And I've been thinking about this week as I've been traveling, watching people's behavior, especially kids, because you're in the airport, you watch their behavior with their parents. And what it made me realize or remember was that parents really start to, through approval or disapproval, they basically teach us what is good and what is bad and how to behave and how not to behave. And they do it through, whether it's criticism or it's compliments or whatever it is. They have subtle ways of giving us approval that kind of starts to regulate our behavior and shows us who we should be, who we shouldn't be. You amplify that out by 10, 15, 20 years, and especially when you go to school and you have teachers doing it and then other authority figures in your life. And eventually you just start to get this idea that, oh, the approval of other people will help me to understand who I should be. If I get approval from someone, it will actually make me a good person. It will make me loved and recognized and revered. But if I don't get approval, then that's a bad thing. I'm doing something negative, or I'm performing in a poor way. And so you can see, if you, as I said, you amplify this over 15, 20, 30 years, it becomes a strong mental habit where we look first to other people to see if they're approving of us, and is that appropriate for us to behave in a certain way or to be a certain type of person, do things in our lives. And if yes, then we continue them. If not, we start to pare back on them. We don't do them anymore. And that's what I think creates this habit of worrying what people think, because you naturally, well, not naturally, you're taught to think in this way as a child. And then slowly you start to naturally, like I was saying, you forecast forward. You think, okay, last time I did something like this, people didn't approve of it. So I'm not going to do any version of that. Maybe it's something like dancing or singing, or maybe speaking in public is a good example of that. Maybe it's asking for a raise, or maybe, you hate selling or whatever it is. Generally, anything where you're extending yourself in a way that could create disapproval, you will find a resistance to it because you'll start mentally forecasting forward. So you have to catch yourself again, like you do with normal worries, You have to catch yourself in the act of saying, "Oh, I'm looking for approval because this is part of my behavior pattern. This is something that I've learned over 30, 40 years of my life, however old you are. And I'm now using it kind of in advance. I'm forecasting forward, even without other people needing to tell me whether I'm approved or not. I'm starting to do it for myself. So hopefully that makes sense. That is the reason why I believe we begin to worry about what people think, is because we're taught, first of all, and it helps us to regulate our behavior. But then slowly we start to do it for ourselves. And for some of us, especially myself included, we tend to fall into the habit of doing it too much. We look out to the world, and especially particular people, which we're going to talk about, we will forecast forward and think, if I do this, they'll criticize me or they'll judge me or they'll not like me. And that's really the risk. And that's what starts to happen. And we limit ourselves greatly in our lives because of this worry. So the other thing, and a great metaphor for this idea of worrying what people think, is that I believe that this habit of worrying what people think is a form of self-regulation. And a good example of this is the speed limit on the roads. So if you've driven a car or you've been in a car, you've probably noticed that there's speed limit signs everywhere around. And those speed limit signs kind of regulate people's speed, their behavior, if you like. Imagine if there were no speed limits in the world. We all just got in our car and we drove as fast or as slow as we wanted to. Some of us would be speeding down the freeway, cutting corners and skidding everywhere. Others of us would be probably driving so slow that we'd be making everyone else feel insane. If there was no regulation of speed limits, it would be an unsafe environment for us to be on the roads. Now, where I live in California, there's a road called the 405, which is a huge freeway. It's quite famous. And sometimes it will have 6 full lanes of traffic. And the interesting thing is that there aren't that many speed signs along the road. They actually don't have them on the side of the road. But what we do as drivers is we kind of self regulate based on the speed of the other drivers. So if there's a lot of traffic, we kind of sit at the same speed. If there's less cars, we will kind of, some of us will go faster than others. You'll notice that. But generally, we stay within boundaries of a limit. And it might be like, and I'm speaking in American terms, it might be between 55 miles and 85 miles, depending on the person. But somewhere in there is where we'll sit. And the point of why I'm telling you this is if you think about your life, that's kind of the same thing. You have sort of like speed limits that you've learned initially because you saw the signs on the side of the road. But then eventually you become like a person driving on the 405 where there's not many speed signs, but you watch everybody else and you drive within the boundaries of what everyone else is doing. Why? Because if you don't, you get a speeding ticket, or maybe you crash, or you get people beeping their horn, or whatever it is. There's a negative consequence to not following the speed limit. And I think in our lives, in a lot of respects, this is exactly what we end up doing: is we limit ourselves within boundaries because other people around us are behaving and acting in a certain way. Maybe they're even criticizing us if we step out of the norm, and they're saying, hey, stay within these limits. This is your safety zone, if you like. Is this a good or a bad thing? It depends on how you look at it, right? For some people, it helps them to get along in life because they conform, they fit into the norm, they're able to relate to other people better, they're able to succeed, say, in their career or in a certain way of living. For some of us, though, because we have kind of, what do you want to say, more cavalier ideas or unique thoughts and ways that we want to live our lives, sometimes those norms start to restrict us. It's like we're going too slow when we want to go faster. So this idea of social regulation is just a part of reality. It's part of how we live our lives, especially if you want to live in the world. Unless you want to be a monk and live in the mountains by yourself, you're going to deal with other people most days. So if you think about how you live your life, a lot of it is regulated by these speed limits or these ways of living within social norms. So that's the other thing I want to talk about. When it comes to stopping worrying what people think, I have learned that there's 4 things that you can do. 4 things that I have done, I should say, that have really helped me to overcome this perception and this way of thinking and feeling and getting restricted by worrying what people think too much. So I'm going to go through them in order and hopefully they'll be useful for you. First one is to realize that it's normal. It's actually normal to want to see what other people think, to have that kind of comparison, or that, like I was saying, the speed limit. You want to look at what other people are doing and you want to fit into that. If you've ever started a new job and you've been brand new in a company, then you've probably noticed that you do this almost unconsciously. So you start to, first of all, the first day you're there, you're very eager and you're trying to make a good impression. But then maybe after a week or two, you start to fall into the habit of behaving like everyone else. You get there around the same time, you speak the same kind of language, you act the same way around certain people because they have more power. Maybe they're a boss or a supervisor versus people who are your peers. All these things are subtle, and we start to self-regulate very quickly. Now, this is actually healthy because you're fitting into the culture and it's enabling you to succeed. So I believe in a lot of respects in our life, this is exactly what you need to do. Is you need to realize that worrying what people think and self-regulating is normal and it's healthy, and you can use it to your advantage. If it goes too far, however, and as I was saying, if you project too far into the negative and you start to limit yourself, that's when it becomes a danger. But if you realize that this worry is actually helping you in some ways because it's giving you speed limits or guideposts or whatever of how to behave in a certain environment or a certain culture or with different people, that's actually a healthy, normal thing. And the reason I tell you that, first of all, is because I don't want you to beat yourself up about the fact that you're worrying what people think. It's normal to worry what people think and to regulate based on their behavior. So that's the first one. The second one, which is very interesting, and it's something I learned from the author James Clear, who wrote Atomic Habits, which I highly recommend if you haven't read that book. I think almost the whole world has read that book now, but Atomic Habits, brilliant book about the psychology of how we behave and our habits and how we change. He had a tweet, actually. I'm not a big Twitter person, but for some reason I saw this tweet. And he said that when you think about the people who you're worried what they think, I'm totally butchering this. When you think about the people who you specifically worry what they think, you'll probably realize it's very few people. And this is my second point, is that to get really clear specifically on who are the people that you are worried about what they think. Because there tends to be, when you think about worry, it's more of a generality. It's like a fog, right? It kind of blinds you because you're in it. You can't see outside of it. But when you start to really truly think about who specifically are the people in my life who I am worried what they think of me, it's probably about 3 people. When you think about it realistically, there's not that many people you're concerned about what they think of you. You're not really worried what strangers think of you, maybe even your colleagues. When it comes down to it, maybe you've got a little bit of ambient worry or fear, but most of it is actually focused on just a couple of people in your life. It might be a parent, might be a brother or sister, it might be someone who you really admire, a mentor or an idol or someone in your life. You have projected onto them a lot of authority or a lot of I don't know what you want to call it. Yeah, authority. Basically, you've given them power to have judgment over you. And what you end up doing is you don't actually ask them if they approve of you, but you just mentally project out and go, wow, if I do this thing, this person is going to judge me and they're going to say, or they're going to look at me in a disapproving way. Whatever it is, we kind of, again, we make a mental picture of what we don't want based on that particular person. I have particular people in my life who I've done that with over many years. And I've realized eventually that most of the time they actually don't say anything if you do something a little left field or weird or different. And even if they do, it can't actually stop you. In reality, it's just what they think. It's just who they are as a person. So this is a really important point, is to echo what James Clear said, is to really get clear on the people who are the ones you're worried about. Who specifically are you worried about what they think of you? And it's probably very few people. Even if you have a grade, you might do it on like these people I'm worried 10%, these people I'm worried 40%, these people I'm worried 80%, whatever. You'll probably notice that there's a grade in terms of how much you're worried what people think when you get down to it. And that's important because that helps you to start to identify what behaviors are acceptable and what aren't, and where you're limiting yourself. So that's the second thing. Third is to ask yourself, what would you actually do differently if you didn't care? What would you actually do in your life that was different if you didn't care what people thought? It's an interesting question. And maybe you want to write these things down, is to say, if I just didn't care at all, if I had no inhibitions and no one knew me and I was a totally fresh, new, clean slate person, what would I do differently in my life? Think about it. It's an interesting question. And we all have kind of an answer that bubbles up very quickly in our subconscious. Oh, well, I'd probably be a dancer or I'd be a speaker. That was mine. I wanted to speak in public, or I'd write a book, or I'd travel, or whatever. There'll be something that will come out of you. And if you know what it is, then you're actually able to do it. Shock, surprise, whatever you want to feel right now, you can actually do the thing that you're terrified of right now in your life. You may not be able to do it really well, but you can actually begin to do it. And that's an important thing to realize because, and I've told this story in different formats over many years, but when I was about 35 years old, I'm 45 now, but when I was 35, I kind of had I don't want to say a midlife crisis, but a self-image crisis where I was like, I'm not being my true self. And what it came down to was that I wanted to speak and talk about personal development. I just love it. I'm a nerd for it. You can see all my books here. I love it, right? And I just wasn't talking about it. And I wasn't sharing my ideas like I am right now. And I started to realize that there were particular people in my life that I was worried what they would think of me if I started talking about this topic. They'd think I was a nerd, or they'd think it wasn't appropriate or whatever, especially for men to express ideas of self improvement is kind of, it's not culturally accepted as much. You got to stay within the confines of what a man is, right? And so for me, that was a big thing I had to overcome. But I realized that if I didn't care what people thought, I would start to do this. And the way I started to bridge out of it, which I'm going to talk about in a second, was by writing. I actually didn't speak for a long time. I used to write. And then slowly I started doing YouTube videos, but I would hide them from everyone that I knew. And you can go back on my YouTube channel and look, like 13 years ago almost. There's videos of me talking about the magic of thinking big and all these different books, The Law of Success by Napoleon Hill. Doing it very badly, but doing it because I finally started to realize at age 35 that, hey, if I didn't care what people thought, this is what I would do. So that's my challenge to you. And point number 3 is to really think about, if you didn't care what people think, what specifically would you do in your life? And that leads me to point number 4, which is to make some tests. Very often, if you have something in your life that you want to do and you're worried about what specific people or generally what people think, the risk is if you think, oh, if I do this, I'm going to have to be like this forever. The truth is, you can regress to exactly who you are right now. Even if you try something in your life, you can change your mind and go, you know what, that was a bad idea. It's almost like speeding up too much in your car. You can slow down. You don't have to stay speeding forever. But the challenge for you is to test or to make a test of the things that you want to do. So for me, the example I just gave was, okay, I'm not confident enough to speak yet, but I'm going to start by writing. So I started a blog about, goodness, I don't know, 12 years ago or something. I started blogging and writing book reviews online of my favorite nerdy personal development books. And then I started doing YouTube videos and I hid them from everyone. And then slowly over time, I got more overt. I joined Toastmasters. I started speaking and doing all these things. And piece by piece, I started to become the person I was by making these small tests. So, whatever it is for you, there would definitely be things in your life that are the same, where you think, okay, I would really love to be or to do this thing, but I'm worried what people think. First of all, figure out who specifically are you worried about? Who is it in your life who you worried is going to criticize you or condemn you for doing or being something different? And then, okay, what would you actually do differently if you didn't care? And finally, is to start to make a test. Try it. Try it for a day. Try it for a week. Try it for a month. Do it in private if you have to begin with. Do it with just a small select group of people. And you'll realize that most people don't care. Most people actually don't even notice and they don't care what you're doing. And as I said earlier, even the ones, if they do criticize you, if they turn on you and say, you're an idiot or you shouldn't be doing this or that's a waste of time or who do you think you are or whatever, they can't actually stop you with their criticism. They can't. You can still be or do or have whatever you want in your life. It's just up to you to choose it for yourself. So that's my final point here, is to make some tests. Try it out, because even if you try it out and you fail or you don't like it, at least you tried. At least you went for it. And it will encourage you to kind of break the barriers a little bit, or the speed limits, if you like, if we use that metaphor, in your life. You'll stop regulating so much based on everyone else and the speed limits, and you'll start to say, okay, I want to go a bit faster, or I want to go a bit slower, or whatever. You'll find ways that you will break out of it. So, my friends, Those are my four things to remember about how to stop worrying what people think. Number one, realize that it's normal. It's normal to self regulate and to look at other people and figure out your way of behaving based on their behavior and their attitudes. It's a normal, healthy thing, but when we take it too far, it starts to limit us. Number two is to think specifically who are the people in your life who you're worried about what they think. And you'll probably be surprised, it's actually a lot less people than you realize. As I said, it's almost like a fog, this worry of what people think. When you start to clarify, well, it's actually these three people in my life who I'm really worried, then you'll start to overcome it. Number three is to consider, if you had no fear of what people think, what would you do or be or have differently in your life? Just explore it and write it down for yourself. And then number four is to make some tests. Try it out for yourself and see, if I just do a little bit of this, if I just push the boundaries a little bit, what happens? And I think you'll be surprised that most people actually, not only do they not care, but they're much more supportive. And even those who criticize you can't stop you. So there we go. Those are my tips to stop worrying what people think. As I said in the beginning, I don't know if you can ever completely stop while ever you live in a society where you're dealing and managing around other people. It's just a reality of self-regulating and being a comfortable, good person in society. But it is a trap if you don't regulate it on the negative side as well, if you let it take over your life. And there's a famous quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, which I'm probably going to not get exactly right, but the quote is, "You wouldn't realize half as much what people thought of you if you realized how seldom they actually do." That's a really good way to remember that, hey, a lot of the time I'm worrying, I'm projecting out onto these people, thinking that they're thinking something about me. But in reality, they're too focused on themselves. And the ultimate irony is that they might actually be worried what you think of them.